Coming up on today's show, we cover our favorite LastPass alternative. We talk about why more boxes might be better than one, and we confess our undying love for Arch. I'm Alex.
And I'm Chris, and this is Self-Hosted 39. I too, Alex, have been worshiping at the altar of Arch recently. After experimenting with various different distributions, I like that I can set up a minimal system, and I actually have been enjoying using Arch as my base application server. I don't run apps directly on Arch, but in containers or VMs, I find it to be a fantastic platform. Been doing it for a while now.
This comes hot off the heels of this week's Linux Unplugged, where I think it's fair to say you got on your soapbox and preached the Arch gospel, huh?
I don't know. I think what I got on my soapbox about was it's become kind of a joke or a meme. Oh, Arch users, people are just trying to flex and talk about how elite they are. When the reality is that's not it at all. I simply just want something that makes it really quick to get software deployed or up and running and maybe have the most minimal Linux installed before I run an application. And I find it great for that without sort of all of the upfront work that something like Gen 2 or Linux from scratch takes.
Hey, bro. I run Arch, by the way.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of how it started. And then it kind of grew from there, didn't it?
It did, yeah. I definitely feel the shame. Like, when you say to people, I run Arch, it's not because you want to flex, or at least I don't want to flex. It's because I just love it so gosh darn much, and I think other people would too if they just gave it a chance. And
well, why is that? I think we should talk about maybe just really briefly why it is you love it so much, because it's not the forums, right? It's not the Arch user base necessarily. It's the practicality of it, right?
It is. I am one command away from pretty much any piece of software that I want. Yay-S everything literally is, the AUR is Arch's secret sauce. Think of anything. Think of a custom kernel. VFIO stuff is pretty complex to get into. There is a custom kernel already compiled, or there's a package build to compile a custom kernel already there for you, ready to go. You want some esoteric piece of software that on Ubuntu would be a PPA, or on Fedora would be a Copper repo. I don't have to worry about any of that. It's just yay-S install and off you go. And besides that, as a new user, when I was getting into Linux in 2013, 14 sort of time period, the Arch documentation is just the best around, and it's crowdsourced. It's not always completely accurate and always completely totally up to date, but it's good enough that even an idiot like me can pick it up and get going when I knew basically nothing. And at that point, that was when Arch had just transitioned to Systemd. So I kind of credit Arch and Systemd and Docker as being the three kind of pillars of what got me into Linux and being able to get me over that initial new user, not knowing what I'm doing hump. Those three things together, for me, were just game-changing.
There really is a Linux for every type. Obviously, there's benefits to running something like Debian or CentOS or Ubuntu LTS on a server that make just a ton of sense for most people. I'm the type of user, I don't mind logging in at least once a week, doing a package update and seeing what needs to be installed. I don't always have time for that. I don't always get to do it weekly, but I generally am able to do it at least once a month, if not twice a month. And that seems to be all it's taken for me to keep these systems up and running. And the benefit that I get from a self-hosting standpoint is my operating system is continuously updated. I don't have this event that comes up every few years where I kind of brace myself and do this massive upgrade. Instead, I take my medicine kind of on a weekly basis, and it kind of stretches out the changes so that they're just more minor. They're more frequent, but they're more minor. I prefer that. And then when you add something like Alex was saying, the AUR, with the package management system, I can get something up and running in moments on Arch that would take a bit of fiddling around, maybe adding a package repository, following a guide to add the keys and all that kind of stuff, to a machine, and then I have the joy of watching that repo go by every time I do an apt update or a DNF update, and not a huge fan of that system. It works, and for some people it works really well. For me, I just like to have it all integrated with a single package manager, single set of updates that I do, and it's always guaranteed to be, at least close to guaranteed, I should say, the latest version when I install something. So I know the security stuff's taken care of, the feature stuff that I've been reading about online, I know it's already landed. And then anything that's more complex than a basic system level tool, I'm already loading in a container anyways. And those are often based on Alpine or Ubuntu, etc. And it kind of doesn't really matter what the host OS is running as long as it's secure and up to date.
I kind of view Arch a little bit like stock Android. You know, like on a Pixel phone or, well, not OnePlus anymore, but definitely on the Pixel phones. Like, it has no opinion. There's no opinionation really in how it does stuff. It just gives you stuff and lets you figure it out by yourself. And for that reason, it makes a really great minimum viable server. It also makes a really great workstation. It could make a great cloud box because you can only install very, very minimal numbers of packages. So from a security perspective, there's a smaller attack surface. The downside is that the industry, and I use air quotes around industry, in the cloud at least, does seem to be settling on Ubuntu, like if you look at market share and stuff like that. So you are kind of trailblazing your own path by going with Arch, but I would argue that what distro you run doesn't really matter that much anymore. I mean, I do feel pretty strongly that, you know, all my systems will just run Arch. You know, if it's a laptop or a desktop or whatever. But if it's a server, I'll probably put Ubuntu on it, even though everything we've just said, because it has Canonical behind it doing a bunch of testing, especially when it comes to ZFS and the licensing there. That's a tricky one, even on Arch. Just a bunch of stuff, bunch of testing and things like that mean that I don't run Arch absolutely everywhere, just most places.
I have found that for the cloud, I'm sticking with Ubuntu LTS for the most part. I find that works really well. And for my Raspberry Pis that are at the RV on an LTE connection, I'm also running Ubuntu LTS there, in part because they've done a really good job with their Pi support, but also less updates is a feature when you're on cellular.
Yeah.
And I'm already updating my laptop enough as it is. So there's those elements of it. But when I have an opportunity to run local physical hardware like I do here at the studio, it's all Arch. It works fantastic. I do have one Arch box up in the cloud that is like an example of Arch in the cloud gone wrong, where the vendor tried to pin to a certain version of the kernel, and of course that just doesn't work very well with Arch. So I think it is a little trickier in the cloud, and it's not a 100% solution. And what I was just advocating now, I guess, here and in that episode of Linux Unplugged is let's not mock people for their choice of distribution. There's functionality behind everything, and like perfectly good reasons to run SUSE as well. My buddy on Coder Radio, Mike, that's what he prefers to run. He likes SUSE in the enterprise. He runs Pop! OS on his desktop and SUSE in the rack, and that works really well for him. It's not like we're trying to create a this distribution is better debate. What we're trying to say is let's include everybody in the conversation and not mock people for their choice of distribution. And as a couple of counter-narrative guys, I guess, we happen to find Arch actually works pretty well if you're willing to maintain it. Linode.com/SSH. Go there to get a $100 60-day credit towards a new account. Yeah, $100 in credit to play with. And of course, you're supporting the show by going to linode.com/SSH. That's where we set up all of our infrastructure for JB 3.0. If we're playing around for something like SSH, like segment work or something, yeah, we do that up on Linode. And speaking of Arch, one of the great things about Linode is they let you pick just about any distribution you want. They have Arch. They got everything. Alpine, Debian, CentOS, SUSE, Ubuntu's, of course. I mean, they got like everything up there. Even some Fedora for you crazy kids out there. You can run it up on Linode. They've been in this game since 2003. They've learned what works and they've learned what doesn't work. And they were doing that years before everybody else. And they've really managed to modernize it with a beautiful cloud dashboard that makes it approachable to somebody who's brand new to servers, or maybe you're like a longtime pro. You're going to love the way this dashboard works. Of course, they have native SSD storage, 40 gigabit connections coming into the machines. It's all super fast. And because they've been around since 2003, they've got some great locations. Like, think about that, right? They can leverage their experience, their relationships in a way that nobody else can because they've been in cloud computing before it was cloud computing. 11 data centers around the world. We got an email into the show from James. He said, I wanted to set up an SMTP relay at my previous VPS provider, but because they were kind of, trying to be competitive in the market, they ended up with not the best IP reputation, and they ended up getting blocked by Microsoft. And so then he spun up another box on their system, and that also got blocked by Microsoft. And he's like, I couldn't even find them on any public blacklist, yet Microsoft just started blacklisting all of these IPs. So I decided I'd go over to Linode and try a Linode over there and support the show. So he goes to linode.com/SSH. He spins up a system on Linode, and he discovers, Linode has a policy where they block all SMTP-related ports by default. Oh, well, I guess I'll email support and see what they say. So he sends off a quick email to support. He gets a prompt response later, and they open up the ports, and everything is working perfectly. He goes, and then a few days later, I finally got a response from my original provider with some canned email that didn't help it at all. I replied to that. I got another canned email response, and that was it. I just gave up, and I'm moving everything over to Linode. They're genuinely just great. And I've gotten so many notes into the show that talk about Linode support. It's not an aspect I touch on a lot, but it really matters once you get up and running, especially if you've got some important infrastructure on there. So go check them out, linode.com/SSH.
Now, I know you covered some stuff about LastPass in Linux Unplugged. This is like Linux Unplugged plus this episode, isn't it? But LastPass have been doing some shenanigans with their free tiers and stuff. I think we've all been expecting this for quite a long time since they were acquired. Now, they are limiting the access to unlimited devices of one type. So to clarify what that means is you can access LastPass free on an unlimited number of computers or an unlimited number of mobile devices, but not both on their free tier. I say enough. I say that stinks. And we have a recommendation for you.
I agree. I mean, the price right now is kind of reasonable. It's like, what, $4 a year or something? It's not outrageous for a year. I mean, but it stinks the way it's going about. And I agree. It's time to look at an alternative. And this is the self-hosted podcast. And I think both of us landed on Bitwarden pretty quickly. I have some trepidation here, though.
Hold on a minute. I think LastPass is $27 a year. It's $2.25 a month billed annually.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Okay. Yeah, you're right. So that's not nearly the deal I thought it was. That's a bad deal.
Especially when Bitwarden is only $10 a year. That's if you buy an annual plan. But if you don't even want to do that, you can self-host the Bitwarden server, which is just so cool.
Yeah, I really love seeing this. And I know it's a little complicated. I think it requires SQL, among other things. So the community has come up with an alternative.
Yeah, there's a project called Bitwarden RS, which is written in Rust. Where's Wes when you need him? And this is a Bitwarden server that can run in a container that will essentially perform the same role as the $10 a year hosted service. The difference being is you own all the data. It remains on your servers or your VPS or whatever. So there's a couple of ways you could go about doing this. The first and most obvious way is to spin up a Linode or something like that and throw Bitwarden on there and just call it good. And because it's your password manager, I would probably caution against running this on a shared cloud VPS. You know, if you're hosting a ton of websites and it's a very public, VPS, I probably wouldn't put your password manager on that same system. I would put it on a separate system just so you're reducing the blast radius of any bots or anything doing something crazy with the web servers. The other thing you can do is run it on your LAN, and I think running it on a separate system becomes less important when it's on your network. And the idea of running it on your LAN, of course, is that your data never leaves your house, right? And that will hopefully reduce the risk even further. Now, the downside of running your own password manager backend is you've got to configure secure access to it. So that could be using WireGuard or some other kind of authentication through SSH or something like that. But ultimately, you're going to want to be really careful and really sure you know what you're doing from a security perspective, before you start going and storing all your passwords on a public system.
That's where you could make the argument that it could just be worth paying for their hosted service. And this is where I'm currently experiencing my trepidation. I 100% know I could self-host it. And the nice thing about this Rust version of their server is really minimal resources. So you could really run it on anything. So I could run it on my Raspberry Pi, or I could run it easily here on the server at the studio. But I'm not sure I want to. There's something about the master password vault. It's such a sacred responsibility that I almost trust an organization like Bitwarden to be more focused on securing that platform than I am. Not that I really have no concerns about our security, really, but there's something that still gives me pause.
They got one job to do, right? And I've actually paid Bitwarden the $10 a year for 2 or 3, maybe 4 years at this point. I've been very, very happy. It just does the job. I never have to think about it. All of the autofill stuff on Android and iOS just works fantastically well. $10 is that kind of screw it amount of money when it's spread over an entire year. It's less than $1 a month. And
yeah,
to just not have to worry about it and to just not have to think about it for 80, 90 cents a month, that's worth it for me.
It reminds me of why I kind of like supporting Nebuchadnezzar and how supporting Nebuchadnezzar goes into Home Assistant development and makes Home Assistant better. By subscribing to Bitwarden, you're helping them come up with a sustainable business model that encourages them to make the password manager better and keep their service secure. So it incentivizes the right things. And on top of that, it means I don't have to host it myself. I haven't actually made my decision because I have kept a lot of business stuff in LastPass for a while. I know I like Bitwarden, so I've always thought that's what I would jump to. And so I went over to their subscription pricing page, and they also offer team plans for as little as like $3 per user, and that's still pretty reasonable. So I think that might be the direction I end up going. I'm going to research more about how they host it first, because I know a big use case for me, a really big use case for me is mobile access. It's such a crapshoot with me. I don't just connect from one machine. It's just ridiculous, especially when you bring in like traveling or setting up family member systems
and hosts.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So I kind of like the idea of something where I'm not handing out WireGuard connections to 15 different people so that way they can access the central password database.
And don't forget as well, generally the time when you need Bitwarden the most is when your device is completely brand new or empty.
Right.
And so you've always got that awkward first 10 minutes where you're getting, your 2-factor auth set up again and your Bitwarden whatever set up again. And once you've got those two things, you're good to go generally. But yeah, I can see you don't want to be handing that out to randos.
If you do want to self-host it though, Alex, like somebody in our audience who may have a different use case, it's easier than ever now because the Bitwarden Rust server has a Docker image fully up to date as of like 19 hours ago as we record this.
It's like the old proverb, if something isn't Dockerized at this point, does it even exist? Now, another nice thing that I do with Bitwarden is I actually share passwords with my wife. She has a Bitwarden. I don't think she pays the premium. I think she just has the basic free account. But we created an organization, and when you create a particular login, you can assign that login to an organization and share it with that organization. So certain passwords for us, like Amazon, eBay, stuff that you want to share, it goes into that shared area, if you like, that shared organization, and we've both got access to it. I find that really useful.
There's, of course, other solutions out there. Another beloved one in the audience is KeePass and KeePassX, and there's several solutions to this, but Bitwarden is the one we both landed on, I think in part because of the UI, the browser integration, the ability to self-host, and the quality of the mobile apps all kind of come together to make it our favorite choice.
So whilst we're sort of kind of on the topic of security, why don't we discuss the Plex hoopla that's been going on as well about this botnet thing that's been amplifying stuff across the internet?
This stinks because, you got a Plex server going. You've opened it up to the internet so that way you can share it. Some scanner finds your server, indexes it, and then some botnet author figures out a way to take advantage of a vulnerability in Plex to amplify by a factor of 5 their DDoS traffic. They kind of corral all of these different Plex installs together to kind of do this amplified attack against a single source. And it just happened the last week as we're recording this. NetScout said that there was a DDoS for hire service that recently turned misconfigured Plex media servers into amplifying attack servers. So it's just,
Ruh-roh.
yeah, not only does it suck up all of your bandwidth and attack somebody, but it also runs your server like crazy. It's bad.
Yeah, and what really kind of, I don't want to use the word scared me, but I suppose so, gave me cause for a concern at least, was just opening port 32400, 32400 on TCP. Just opening that port alone is enough to be vulnerable because it's such a common port. People will scan it and find it and then be like, oh, this guy's running Plex.
Yeah.
So what I've done since this vulnerability to kind of remove myself from the risk factor is I've closed that port in my firewall and I have started to define a custom server URL in my Plex server settings. And I set a DNS entry in Cloudflare. That then points to my WAN IP. From there, that then points to a traffic instance that's running on the same server as Plex. And from there, it does a standard reverse proxy thing and just does the remote access as if I was going through port 32400 like I was last month. Very easy fix, and I highly recommend you take a look into that.
That's a great idea because NetScout said that after a scan they conducted, they found about 27,000 servers on the internet that can be abused this way. So if it doesn't mean you have to shut off remote Plex, but it does mean you should probably take some steps to protect yourself.
Yeah, just put it behind a reverse proxy. I mean, it doesn't have to be traffic. It could be Nginx, could be whatever, but just don't open any ports in your firewall. You absolutely don't need to. Which actually brings me very nicely onto a very, very quick bit of follow-up about the WireGuard rant I had last week on OpenSense.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out, like an idiot, I set a /16 subnet in my DHCP server. Now, for those that don't know, what that means is every address from 192.168.0 all the way up to 192.168.255 was within my DHCP range. So I had 65,000 or whatever DHCP addresses available. The upshot of that was when I was trying to route through WireGuard, I was doing a 192.168.13 subnet. And so the remote servers were receiving the commands from my laptop or my phone or whatever, but they didn't know how to route back to the client device because, so far as they were concerned, the /16 overrode everything and it just thought everything was on the LAN. So what I did was I changed the subnet of the WireGuard VPN to a 10 dot something, so it was in a completely different subnet, and I reduced my /16 down to a more manageable /20. So I've only got a few thousand, like 4,000 addresses now instead of 65,000. I think that should tie me over for a bit, right?
Nicely done. I definitely always suggest, if people can, different subnets for the different VPN endpoints. Makes it so much simpler. And I've tried to do that myself so many times because it can solve you just a few simple problems and keeps it a little clearer in your head. Like, I know that the studio is .4 and home is .7 and the WireGuard network is actually a .10 network. It's all separated out.
Yeah, so I just wanted to be absolutely clear that the problem was the user, not OpenSense or WireGuard. It was totally my fault. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to one of our listeners who reached out to me on Discord and did a screen share with me and walked me through it for half an hour because he works in security down in Charlotte in North Carolina. And he sort of taught me some new stuff about, networking and triage and that kind of stuff. So that was pretty cool. So huge thank you to that listener.
Sounds like somebody we should buy a beer for when community events happen again.
One day. Yeah.
Well, if you'd like to learn networking or anything else, ACG has 20% off annual plans right now. We'll have a link in the show notes or just go to cloudguru.com. And when you sign up, use the promo code SpringIntoCloud21. You know that cloud is growing. There's lots of new services and systems, more every day it seems. And that also means the demand for skilled cloud professionals is growing too. 82% of hiring managers say a cloud certification makes a candidate more attractive. So go grow your skills with hands-on labs and learning. Keep up with change and develop the skills you need with a Cloud Guru. To get that 20% off, sign up for an annual plan and use that promo code SpringIntoCloud21. 95% of learners say that a Cloud Guru's tools and content directly help them advance their careers. Spring into Cloud 21, link in the show notes, or go to cloudguru.com.
Ryan writes in with an iGPU question. Hey there, friends. I'm a big fan of the show. I currently am in the process of building an off-grid house in New Zealand. Oh, that's the
I
dream.
know, right?
Amazing.
Can we come visit?
Self-hosted on tour. Power consumption is key, so I want a small box to run basically everything I need, which thankfully isn't going to be that much. My question is it possible to run a Linux server and pass through an iGPU to a Windows VM for Blue Iris, while still using the iGPU for containerized applications like Plex? I can't seem to see any problem with this in theory, but wonder if you have any ideas. Love your work, Ryan.
What do you think about this one? I have also contemplated, is there a way I can have my cake and eat it too when it comes to an iGPU and a low power system?
I thought I'd solved this problem. I thought I had the answer. And it was a technology called gvt-g, which is a virtual graphics card kind of slicing thing that basically lets you take an Intel GPU built into your CPU and slice it up into two slices and give one to one VM and one to another. So the obvious use case for that is to give one slice to a Windows VM for Blue Iris, and then give the other slice to another Linux VM for Plex, and then keep the host as clean as possible.
Yeah.
However, and I've written a blog post about this week, unfortunately, the performance of gvt-g is horrible. I found it to be anywhere from 58 to 82% slower than QuickSync being run natively on the bare metal host.
Holy smokes. I did not expect that at all.
Yeah, so my test that I did was pretty unscientific, but it was a very real world use case for me. So I used the Plex Sync for offline playback feature, and I chose a high bit rate, so about a 38 megabyte a second, or is it megabit? I always get confused. Video file encoded with MPEG-4 and H.264 with a DTS master audio soundtrack. And I used the 4 megabytes a second 720p sync for offline playback option within Plex. And I did that on an iPad. You know, that was the client. I don't think that bit really mattered too much. But I did a few different tests. So I did a software render. So this is using the Intel i5-8500 CPU. I picked that up for about $100 used on eBay. So it's a pretty good value. 4 gigahertz, I think 4.1 gigahertz, 6-core CPU. With CPU rendering only, I saw a 1.1 times speed. The best I saw running it natively in QuickSync on the host was 10.2. And then on a sliding scale between those two numbers of 1 times and 10 times, with the gvt-g stuff set into 2-slice mode, I saw only about a 1.8, 1.9 times. So it was faster than CPU software encoding, you know, twice as fast actually, but it was 82% slower than running it on the bare metal host. So the other problem that I ran into, besides, you know, leaving 80+% performance on the table, was stability. Unfortunately, that wasn't a great story either. The problems I ran into were, so I was running Proxmox as the base OS because the Proxmox wiki actually has a really great entry about enabling gvt-g and QuickSync and pass-through and all that kind of stuff. And it was really painless to get going. It only took me an hour or so to figure it all out and get it going. But the stability was just not there. My evidence is only anecdotal though. Because of the instability, I couldn't really get the log files that I needed because the system either had to be hard reset or it was just hanging and processes were just hanging, or I was getting kernel panics. It was just a mess. And, you know, at the end of the day,
Just not something you could just let run and just not have to think about it.
no, unfortunately it wasn't. And, you know, things worked fine until I powered on the Windows VM that was running Blue Iris. And that system has 6 4K cameras going into it. So it's got a decent amount of load. Now, I know for a fact that the i5 CPU can handle that load because it's been running in my HP 290 Slim for 6 months just fine, handling everything perfectly. But for some reason, when it's in the gvt-g mode, it just, I guess because the performance is so poor with the emulation, whatever they're doing to slice the GPU up, however they're doing it in the Intel drivers, it just meant that as soon as I powered up Blue Iris, within 30 minutes, the whole Proxmox system was just unhappy. Like the web UI wouldn't load sometimes, or you actually go and reboot the system and you'll see systemd printing out, waiting on QEMU guest to shut down for like 30 minutes. And
So it wasn't just guest stability issues, but the entire host. Ooh, yeah, that's just a deal breaker. Oh man, Alex.
At the end of the day, you want it to be on and functional. And yes, this is a hobby and I do enjoy messing about with servers, but there comes a point.
It's not a full-time job.
Nah, exactly. There comes a point where you're like, this S just needs to work now.
Yeah.
And it just didn't, unfortunately.
I think you crossed the threshold of devoting more time to this than most folks quite a while ago. I mean, even taking a pass at the different encoding options, that's good insight. And it really shows you that it's almost twice as fast if you use GVT. When you consider the stability issues, I would rather just use CPU encoding.
CPU encoding with QuickSync, because that's only pulling down about 10 watts when it's doing a full 1080p stream, and it's running at 10x real time. So it actually, in terms of performance per watt, is the best thing out there. I actually also, just for giggles, used my 1080 Ti to run one of these transcodes. So QuickSync is running at 10x. A 1080 Ti, which is pulling down 18 times the amount of power, is running at 17 times. So 10x versus 17x.
Wow. It's a good way to see the performance discrepancy between Intel's GPU and the NVIDIA GPU right there, isn't it? You can really... And then, of course, CPU with its measly 1.1x.
Yeah. Performance per watt of the NVIDIA card was just hilariously bad.
Well, sure.
So what I've ended up doing, actually, and this is to go back to Ryan's question now, is I've ended up splitting things back out into physical boxes. The Blue Iris box is an HP 290 Slim that I already had. I've put the i5 back into there, and I bought another i5 to put into my server, so I have two now, which is a shame, but hey-ho. I was doing some testing on the HP 290 for average power usage. When I say idle, what I mean by that is Blue Iris is running with its normal sort of load. So an average sort of power usage I see on that box is anywhere from sort of 10 to 25 watts, depending on what it's doing, which for the performance I'm getting, that kind of power usage is fantastic, really. And then my main server is pulling it anywhere with, it's got, I think, 12 hard drives in it, anywhere from 40 to 80 watts at idle. So it's all pretty good, pretty low, to have all that performance for under 100 watts at idle I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the details with us. You mentioned the blog in there. Well, Sam actually writes in with our next question. He's a new listener, and he says, I'd love to hear more about what Alex uses for building his blog, and if you've experimented with any other options and what you thought. Thanks for the great show.
Well, several years ago when I was launching linuxserver.io, I actually had a personal blog, blog.katez.me. That got turned into Linux Server's blog and eventually the Linux Server website, and that kind of took over and became its own thing. So we used to use WordPress, and then we moved to Ghost on Linux Server, and this would be, I dread to think how long ago, like 5 years ago. We moved to Ghost, and it's been so solid. I then ended up spinning up Ghost for my own personal blog to do like travel writing and all that kind of stuff as well. So I use Ghost almost exclusively for blogging, and then the Perfect Media Server website is written in MKDocs.
I live vicariously through you on Ghost. That was the route I thought I might go if I were going to set up a blog again. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes because I think that's worth checking out. Although they've changed their model a lot since I first originally found them. Now they seem like they're really focused on them hosting the blog. But you can still self-host and all that?
Self-host out of a container, yeah. And I've actually got a custom theme. So I spent quite a bit of time before the Perfect Media Server 2020 edition came out, making sure that my blog had search and a few other different, like fav icons and social media icons, all that kind of crap. So you can customize the theme relatively easily, and all of that stuff is open source in GitHub. So, I have no complaints about Ghost at all. It just does exactly what I need. It looks pretty good, and you see it all over the place on the internet, really. So I think that's kind of proof is in the pudding. How many blogs do you see that are in Ghost? Quite a few. So yeah, it must be okay. All right. So I think our final question for today, Tarmo writes in about user account management. Hi guys, I'm a new listener and this show is perfect for me. I started at episode 1. Well, thank you. I was wondering if you have done a podcast about how you manage different servers and user accounts. Do you have LDAP or some kind of centralized authentication? I'm finding creating unique user accounts for every server and saving their credentials every time to be a bit of a pain in the bum. I was wondering if you have any thoughts. Looking through the episode descriptions, I didn't find anything about this. Thanks, Tamo.
Good question, because it's been on my mind a lot. Recently, Linux distributions like Fedora and Ubuntu added checkbox Active Directory support to their installers, and that got me thinking, yeah, almost wouldn't mind having like an Active Directory set up here on the LAN, either actual Active Directory or some Samba Frankenstein version of it. But truthfully, what I have landed on is standardized accounts. So we have a standardized studio account, and I have an account on all the systems. And the people who work here at the studio, we know those logins. And then for our server logins, we use SSH keys. But I do long term have my eye on systemd, homed as a potential way to solve this, at least here on the LAN at the studio. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. But essentially, it takes your home directory and all of your user information and puts it into JSON. And then you can drop this home directory bundle into a systemd, homed enabled system. And not only does your home directory show up there, but you also then become a user on the system. That's obviously me giving you the short version, but it has some potential. So you could see here in the studio where perhaps we'd keep our master home directories on the server and then rsync them down to the studio machines and my workstation, I don't know, every hour, every 24 hours. I don't know. I haven't really looked into it yet. But if we did that, it would also sync down our user credentials. Early days, just something that's on my horizon, kind of keeping on my radar as a possibility, because I don't need something too advanced. I've managed large LDAP single sign-on installations in the past as part of my job, and it worked surprisingly well for a long time, and I just don't really have an interest in doing that anymore.
I mean, you could spin up LDAP, you could do free IPA, you could do a lot of things, but...
Could do Active Directory. It kind of sounds kind of fun. I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't know about you, but I've got to the point over the last decade where I'm managing so many different systems. Some of them are in different houses or different cloud providers or stuff like that, that having them sync back to a central authentication would just be so complicated. I've kind of got, I feel like, half decent at context switching between the different servers and knowing, oh, right, I don't have that particular setup on this one. And any files I do need to sync between various things, I have my NAS and I just mount that via Samba. And I don't really worry too much about the home directory. Anything that's in there, is, in my opinion at least, is ephemeral. It goes in Git or it goes in Samba or it gets lost. That's kind of how I treat it.
Yeah, I think in part it's because I have, in full disclosure, I've accepted a security practice on the LAN of the studio that probably you shouldn't do, and that is we don't rotate passwords very often, maybe once every couple of years. But then again,
it's convenient. I'll give you that.
Yeah, and as far as physical access goes, it's a real small handful of people. It's not like an organization with an office of 20 here. And then for the servers, it's pretty much all down to SSH keys, and all remote login is usually done with that. Any access to the LAN is done with WireGuard, and that has its own set of keys. So there's some layers there. Every now and then, I still think it's a fair question. I still think to myself, I could do this a little better. And I do fantasize about a future where I deploy everything programmatically and then everything has central sign-on and central storage. But I think I'd have to like clone myself to get there.
But this goes back to the point at the beginning, right? You use Arch because you just want to get stuff done. And I think we don't use a central authentication system because we just want to get stuff done. Like, we don't want to spend a week or two figuring it out and setting it up, and then every time we reinstall a box, attaching it to a domain controller or whatever it is.
Right.
I think it's just pragmatism, isn't it? That means we're lazy and don't do it.
Maybe that's a bit of it. If we've gotten old, what we need is a young SSH intern to come into the studio and whip us together and get a single sign-on going.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you to our members over at selfhosted.show/SRE. Thank you for supporting the show. As a thank you, we supply you a limited ad version of the show, and you also in that feed get extra content, the post show. Thank you very much to our members at selfhosted.show/SRE.
We're going to have a little bit of a 3D printing hoedown in the post show today, I think.
Yeah, I look forward to that. And I also have a bit of a confession to make. Just a little bit of business before we go. Everything we talk about is over at selfhosted.show.
As always, you can go to selfhosted.show/contact for all the ways to get in touch with us. And you can find me on Twitter at IronicBadger.
I'm there too, at Chris LAS, and the show at Self-Hosted Show.
On Discord, I'm at AlexKTZ. Thanks for listening. That was selfhosted.show/39.